Hey y'all, this is AJ with Blackhawk Bushcraft, and I had a thought. I posted a video the other evening talking about the different types of Firesteels, the hard Swedish type and the softer Chinese metal type, and I thought it might be helpful to talk about technique. There's a lot out there. There's nothing that I'm going to share that's going to be like earth-shattering, that probably hasn't been said a bazillion times over. But I thought it might be helpful to show what works for me related to technique and talk about specific things that one should take into consideration when using Firesteels to increase their chances of success. I will say this. Just because you have a Firesteel doesn't mean that you should use a Firesteel, because with what you're dealing with related to building a fire, this may not be the most effective or efficient ignition source to use outside of other things. But that being said, it's always fun to practice and to learn and to test one's abilities with something like a Firesteel or flint and steel or matches or the proper use of a lighter or whatever it is, a Fresnel lens, doing fire by sunlight, whatever that is. So this video is specifically going to focus on the use of Firesteels and some techniques that may improve your ability to be more successful, some things that you should take into consideration. So the first thing that you need to take into consideration with a Firesteel is the type of Firesteel. Not all Firesteels are created equal. Again, in my previous video, you've got harder type Swedish Firesteels and softer metal type Firesteels. Come in different types of diameters, okay? But there's a lot of differences and there's pros and cons to each. So with a harder type Firesteel, like the Light My Fire or any type of hour metal Swedish type Firesteel, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate Tinder considerations to catch a spark, because it's going to be a little bit harder because this doesn't, I'll kind of show you what I mean using a dedicated striker, and this is going to go to one of my other points that I want to talk about. So you take a dedicated striker that has a burr on the end of it, and as you're making your sparks, like the Swedish Firesteel gives you very hot but very fine sparks, which will ignite appropriate tinder sources. You also have the harder Chinese type, which give you really big molten globs that will continue to burn, and because it's softer, you're removing more material. So as you're putting that material into your tinder source, the more material that's burning, obviously, the greater the likelihood of starting a fire. That being said, you've got some of these types of Firesteels that you can get at dollar stores or a couple bucks or whatever, that although they work, like this one right here, you really have to use a lot of pressure. And while you can get a fire started with these cheaper versions that also come from overseas, but the formula is a little bit different. It's not quite hard. It's not the efficient and effective Swedish type that doesn't require hardly any pressure to generate sparks, but it's also not the really soft kind that allows you to remove a bunch of material. Yes, they work, but be careful with what you're choosing for a Firesteel, because all Firesteels are not created equal. That said, a majority of the Firesteels, like this one here, this is one that I made myself. I just get the blanks. These blanks actually come out of JX Metal Manufacturing in Shanghai, and I think that they produce probably 70% of the world's Chinese metal Firesteels. Those that don't come out of JX Metal Manufacturing are probably sourced from JX Metal Manufacturing and then branded with a different label, or somebody puts a fancy handle on it or whatever. These ones actually are very decent and really good. So you've got your Firesteel. The other thing to take into consideration is the diameter. So this is a 5.5, almost a 6-inch rod by 1/2 of an inch, which means as I'm scraping down this Firesteel, okay, I have a bigger surface area to scrape more material off into my tinder source. The smaller the diameter, such as this little guy right here, not that the diameter is all that big of a concern, but it's just you don't have a whole lot of surface area that you're scraping. You have much less surface area. And this one's kind of one of those crappy Firesteels too. So sometimes you have to go a little bit faster, and you really just don't have the same amount of surface area that you have on something like this, where you're taking off a larger amount of material. So Firesteel consideration is the first thing that you should think about. Again, if you know what you're doing, or you plan accordingly and know how to prepare your tinder, either one of these is going to work very well. A lot of the times the failures that come from Firesteel, or the use of a Firesteel, are due to one of three things. Well, I guess you could call it four things: the right tool or the right type of Firesteel, proper technique, tinder considerations, and moisture. If any one of those things is off or out of balance, you're going to find it more difficult to get a fire started with a Firesteel, because there's so many things that you have to take into consideration. A lot of people think that if you have a Firesteel, you can just go do whatever you want, throw some sparks, and then boom, you got your fire. But that's not the case. It's very much the same as using flint and steel. Like, you have your char cloth. Your char cloth has to be charred to the point that it can catch a very fine spark, not a hot white spark. They're orange sparks, which means that they oxidize and burn at a much lower temperature than what a Firesteel does. And then you've got your bird's nest, something to accept the char cloth, so that when you blow into it, you can complete the fire triangle and get yourself a fire. A Firesteel is no different. You have to take that into consideration. So this is what I see, or I've seen a lot of people do, is they'll have something like, well, I've feathered a stick and I've got all my shavings here, so I'm just going to start throwing some sparks in there. Well, the problem that you have is similar if I were to take a match or a lighter and say that I had a log that was like a good 6-inch diameter and just hold the lighter under the log. The likelihood of that thing going up in flames is, it's just not going to happen, because the ignition source is not right for the size of fuel that you're trying to combust. The same thing applies to shavings or feather sticks. If you're using a ferro rod, you need to ensure that your fuel source is small enough to accept a spark and combust, so that you're not throwing sparks into some shavings that may just be way too thick or not fine enough to catch a spark. Okay, so you can have the right technique, you can have the right ferro rod that will act as a successful ignition source, but if you do not have the right tinder consideration, or you haven't prepared your tinder well enough, it's just not going to work, and you're going to find yourself feeling frustrated. Okay, the other thing is moisture. So say that you have an appropriate tinder source. We're going to use a little bit of this cottonwood bark, and we've got some shavings here too. But say that you prepare your tinder source efficiently, and it is exactly what's needed to, sorry with the camera going in and out there, it's exactly what you need to catch a spark. If you're fighting against moisture, regardless if your tinder source is perfect and your Firesteel is perfect and your technique is perfect, it's just not going to work. So as such, you should plan accordingly and be wise and bring some prepared tinder with you. Something like a fire plug, or you can use cotton balls, whatever that prepared tinder is. Fat wood is another one. Bring some with you in the event that you need to fight against moisture, because the thing that I will say is, even if this cottonwood bark is a little bit damp, which is very much the case depending on the time of year or how you're harvesting this, you cannot always rely on dry tinder depending on the scenario that you may be dealing with. But if you have something like a cotton ball or a fire plug that is soaked in paraffin wax or paraffin oil or fat wood that will burn, it gives you a coal extender and gives you enough to catch your spark, but also to combust your material and or to dry it out a little bit to get that flame going. Same thing with shavings off of a feather stick. You know, you can cut your feather stick and you may find that you have a little bit of moisture, or maybe it's not quite dry enough. Now, if I had a lighter on this, that thing would go up perfect, because the flame in the ignition source is exactly the right thing for igniting feathers. Not that you can't light feathers with a ferro rod, you just need to make sure that your feathers are fine enough to catch those. Just because you feather a stick does not mean that you can always catch those feathers using something like a ferro rod. Okay, so the right tool, the right technique, the right Tinder considerations, and ensure that you're planning in the event that you're dealing with a little bit of moisture. Okay, so when I'm talking about technique, sometimes what happens is an individual will think, well, I've got to use the back of my knife. I've got to have a 90-degree spine on my knife. While a 90-degree spine will work to throw sparks, depending on the thickness of the spine and the knife itself, the knife may not be the best choice for you. And so sometimes I'll see people using their knife, and this is kind of what it looks like. Okay, in fact, I'll just grab my knife out here, because I'm going to be using it. So you have your knife, and this is what they're doing. They're kind of, you know, this type of a motion, which I will admit, that's how I started out years ago, learning the technique. Is, you know, you're hitting it hard and you're trying to throw off the sparks with your knife, and the sparks are going everywhere. But I found that every knife is also not created equal, and every knife that's branded with a 90-degree spine is not created equal. And sometimes you'll see that you'll get ridges, and I talked about this in my last video, ridges along here. That has nothing to do with the technique or the pressure as much as it does that the edge that you're using is maybe not fine enough to actually remove the material. And so instead it kind of bounces along the Firesteel and creates those divots. Okay, that is why a dedicated striker may actually be the best thing, because they have this burr on one side of it, the other side is rounded, you can feel the burr, that's the side that you use, and that is specifically designed to remove that material, so that when you're applying your downward pressure and removing the material, you're not getting the ridges. As you can see here, there are no ridges in that Firesteel. This is the area that I just scraped, because that edge is so fine and so sharp, it's not wanting to bounce along. And even if that was really sharp, if it was really wide, it still may not work well. Okay, so a dedicated striker may be your best bet to increase the chances of your success using a ferro rod. You do not always have to use the back of a knife. Okay, I know that everybody says you need a 90-degree spine so you can use the back of the knife because it's multi-functionality. You can use your knife, but you can use your spine. Yes, if your tool is made for that. Just because it has a 90-degree spine does not necessarily mean it is going to work better than a dedicated striker. Okay, and the only way that you're going to know that is by practice. Now this knife right here has a very sharp 90-degree spine, so even on this Chinese ferro ride, like I can't do it slow like I can on the Light My Fire and get it, but when I give it a little bit of pressure, that thing just shaves off the metal. And this is what I'm talking about. Look at that. There's no ridges. This is probably 1/8 of an inch, I think, 3.2 millimeters, and it is super sharp. And a lot of people, quite frankly, don't like their knives sharp on the spine, because some people prefer to have their thumb up here when they're carving. I'm one that I don't put my thumb on the spine, so I don't care that the spine is sharp. If it did have a rounded spine, I still wouldn't care, because I could just use a dedicated striker. Okay, so it really comes down to your preference. If you want to use your knife to strike your Firesteel, then make sure that it has a spine that will allow that to be effective when you're trying to remove material. If not, if it's not sharp enough or it's too thick, you'll find yourself just kind of throwing sparks off here and there. You're not going to really get the material removed, and then you're going to get all those little ridges along there. And that's why this knife, that's why this rod that I showed in my last video had those ridges, because there's a knife that I have that, although it has a sharp spine, it's like a 1/4 inch thick. It's a big giant splitter knife, and yeah, it can take off some material, but this is the effect that you get, is you get those ridges. Okay, you will not get those ridges with a smaller, sharper edge. In fact, I can probably just kind of cut those off or sand them off. That's what I typically will do, is sand them. So if you get the ridges, it's not a big deal. But now, as far as technique, again, we've kind of talked about, you know, kind of hitting it and throwing them everywhere. The sparks are going to go where your rod is pointed. Okay, so if you want the sparks to go into your tinder source, you need to do one of two things. You need to plant the end of your rod in your tinder and scrape down with your knife in that motion, or you need to anchor your knife and pull up so that when you're throwing those sparks, they're going into the tinder where you're wanting that to go. The way that you can anchor this is with your foot. You can just hold it on your foot and then pull up like this so that knife is not moving, and throw the sparks into your tinder. Or you can just plant the edge in your fire bundle. Now, which method do you use? I think you just have to kind of consider what you're dealing with. If you have a big fluffy nest like this, maybe it's not going to be the most effective thing to stick this in 3 inches and then try to, you know, scrape down. Maybe the best way is to anchor your knife and then pull up on the ferro rod against the spine to throw those sparks in. Okay. What else was I going to say? Oh yeah, this is what I'll say too. I've heard all sorts of stuff out there, and I'm not saying that people are right or they're wrong. For heaven's sakes, I'm not right and I'm not wrong. I'm just sharing my opinion. But I've heard that if you can't get it started within 3 strikes, then something's wrong with your technique or something's wrong with your tinder or whatever. That's not entirely true. You can be doing everything right. It just may mean that you need a few more strikes. No different than using flint and steel. Okay, it may take me 3 hits to catch a spark on a piece of char cloth, or sometimes maybe I do it in 1, and everything is exactly the way that it needs to be. So don't feel like if you've got to do 10 strikes in your, you know, to light your tinder, that something's wrong with you. It just means that you need more practice. I don't think that there's a right or wrong to say you got to do it in 1 or you got to do it in 3 or 5. The most effective thing is learn how to use the tool correctly and then refine your skill as you gain more experience. Okay, so here we've got some cedar bark. Sorry, not cedar. This is cottonwood. Okay, and we're gonna light this with the ferro rod, and I'm gonna talk about one thing too, because I've got this here. Okay, cotton balls. There's a reason why cotton balls light so quickly and easily. It's because the fibers are so fine that the amount of ignition that you are giving to those fibers allows it to combust in 1 strike almost every single time. Okay, you don't necessarily have that benefit with natural fibers. And I know there's people out there that say you need to learn how to source everything from nature. If you're not going to do that, then you've got something wrong with you. I disagree with that, because these are the same people that are going out with their knives, using the back of their knives or whatever to scrape, and they're telling you that you got to source everything from nature to use a Firesteel. Well, why aren't they out there forging their knives first, making their tools, and then using their tools? You see what I'm saying? You can't say that, well, you've got to source everything for your fire, don't use any man-made materials, or don't take any prepared tinder with you, when you're actually taking a tool and you're not making that out there. So I don't think that there's anything silly. I think it's kind of ridiculous to assume that you can't think ahead and be wise and have something with you in case you need it. And I'm going to actually show you that here in a minute too. But with tinder, if you do source this, like with this cottonwood, you have some cottonwood that is really fine, and then some cottonwood that is like needing to be processed down. And even though I probably could put my ferro rod on there and just go back and forth, I call it fast and furious, that type of a technique where you'll see somebody and they will just be going to town on that rod, just like boom, 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 boom. You know, it creates enough heat that eventually something is going to catch, regardless if it's been processed down the way that it probably should. But hey, if that's how you do it, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that there's a better way to refine your skill to where you don't have to do that. But if that is the way that you like to do it, by all means, do what works for you. So I've got this bark, and you've got some of these little fibers here. And what I like to do with cottonwood, it's the same thing I do when I'm using cottonwood for flint and steel, is really prepare that down. This actually feels like it has a little bit of moisture in it. So I do not think this may work as well as I had hoped, but this is what I have. So this is actually going to be a really good test to do on camera, because quite frankly, hey everybody, everything doesn't always work the way that it should. Okay, so you get this really, really fine stuff that comes off when you do that. So I don't want to use all of this, so I'm going to break a piece of this off, and I'm just going to take all this fine stuff. I'm going to keep mixing it up here. And I don't really have a script with me, so if it sounds like I'm rambling, it's because I am. I just grabbed my stuff and came out to do a video and talk to y'all and try to share something that hopefully you find useful. If not, tell me in the comments that it sucks. I'm totally fine with that. Okay. You also want to make sure that you've got a good surface area. Do not compress this. You do not want to compress it, because then you are really cutting off one of the three things that you need as far as the fire triangle is concerned. Is you need oxygen. So make sure that your ball can breathe. Okay. So we're going to do that. And then let's see. This is the Light My Fire one. And again, Light My Fire is great, but I'll tell you what, these work way better on smaller amounts of tinder than big giant piles like this. But we're going to give this a go. In fact, I will make this a little bit smaller, and we can always transfer it if we need to. I hope this works, because again, this feels like it's got a little bit of moisture in it. Okay. Let's give this a go. Just gonna get that material, and there it goes right there. Okay. So not too bad. It actually ignited. I didn't see that it ignited before I started with the other strikes, but again, if your tinder source is prepared efficiently, you can just put that in down there, strike it, and those little fibers will catch without any problem. Okay. Now let's say that you've got a really bigger bundle, and the Light My Fire would probably do that too. We're just going to throw all this stuff in here, and let's gather up all these little shavings too, and let's use that Chinese rod. And the back of the knife on this one, going to do the same thing. I'm just going to push that in there, and I'm going to down. There it goes, just like that. Okay, let's put that out. Okay. So that's the method right there. Just put it in there, and just with moderate pressure, push down towards your tinder bundle. I know a lot of people frown on that because they're like, well, you're going to hit your tinder bundle. And yes, I have seen that, and I have done that in years past, trying to learn how to do things a better way, where I'm doing this up above the pile, trying to throw the sparks, and I'm hitting that tinder pile. And if you hit that tinder pile, well, you could catch a spark and actually extinguish the spark, because now you've like scattered your tinder everywhere. So if you're going to do that with the knife toward the tinder, make sure that you anchor that into your tinder pile, and then just go down with pressure toward it, just like that, and you'll have no problem, and you won't hit your tinder all over the place. And I keep hitting the camera, and I'm sorry about that. The other method is to anchor, like I showed you here. So you'll anchor your fist, and you pull up on, just like that. Okay. You can do that one more time. You get your foot. My foot actually should be flat, but because I keep hitting the camera, whatever, I'm just going to anchor my knuckles on there. Again, pull up, and there you go. The Thing is with the pull-up method is you want to make sure that you're anchored so that knife doesn't move, so that you are pulling up on the stationary edge of that knife without kind of doing one of those motions. So I find that you can anchor it, but you can actually pull it up too, even if you don't anchor it. Just kind of hold your, like, if you could see my knee right now, you'd see that my elbows kind of bend around my knee, and you can kind of anchor it that way too. And you can do that. Okay. So the one thing that I wouldn't recommend is just kind of have your arm out here unanchored. Either put your elbow around your knee and then pull up, but you're still going to get a little bit of that motion, but you can kind of straighten your arm a little bit. But you see how you'll kind of move even with them anchored. It'll still work okay. It's not as effective as actually planting your knuckles and pulling up to where you get the least amount of movement with your knife when doing the pull-up method versus the downward stroke method into the tinder. Just don't have your arm floating out here unanchored. And not saying that you can't do it, but you'll probably find that the sparks will be going all over and you'll eventually catch it. But again, this is just one of those things that comes with practice. Just practice, practice, practice. That's all I can say. Okay. Now, what if you did have some moisture? Okay. This actually felt a little bit damp, but it's actually working very well. And that's probably because it is so fine and some of those little fibers are just catching without any problem. Maybe some of the other stuff would, but again, like if I were to do this, let's switch this over. Like I'm pretty sure I can probably maybe get this going. These are some pretty coarse curls, even though they're very nice shavings. Like it's just like you don't want to do this. Like you want to make sure that you've prepared your tinder the right way. And I'm going to just kind of go down. Yeah, see, like I'm all the way down the bottom. Those things are down there just burning, but it's not wanting to catch. And the reason why is the pile, it has too much openness because the curls are not fine enough. Versus like if I were to shave some curls on this, you know, get some of these really fine curls, like with the edge of the knife, you get some of these really fine ones, which this piece of wood's garbage. It's just turning into dust too. Okay, so you get like some of these, you want to get some of these little fine ones that can kind of catch, and I'm not saying that this is perfect. I'm just trying to kind of give you an example of what I mean. There we go. Like some of these little fine curls right there. We'll actually try this with the edge of the knife, get some of these curls, and if I can get those to catch, then the rest of that stick is going to catch without any problem. Okay, let's see what we can do here. There we go. See, if they're fine enough, they'll catch without any problem. This is with the light my fire rod. We'll just let that burn out over here. Okay. Oh, I guess that's another thing of the technique with the let me just push this out with the feather stick. This is a piece of honey locust, which is harder than oak. This is not the best wood for making feathers, but you just basically get your fine curls, you know, and you got your other feathers, and then your really fine ones to catch that spark, and just hold your rod, right on the stick itself, and then just go right into the sparks, or sorry, go right into the curls off of your ferro rod, and those the little curls that are at the bottom of your big curls will ignite, and then everything will just kind of go up. So I hope that makes sense. But yeah, just having a pile of curls like this would be great for a lighter, but a pile of curls that are really coarse, even if you have a big giant ferro rod, you're gonna have to really work to get that going. You're gonna have to build up enough heat and have enough stuff starting to burn that eventually it'll start. So I don't recommend getting coarse curls that you shave and then sticking your ferro rod in there like that. If you do have something like this, do the same thing. Just like try to break them down and process the fibers as best you can from what you've accumulated. But this is not the ideal tinder for a ferro rod, in my opinion. Now, some of you may disagree and say, oh, you just need more practice, man. I could do a snot rocket on that thing and ignite it. Okay? I just always want to take my time to make sure that the stuff that I'm using is fine enough that my ignition source is not going to struggle catching these. Again, it kind of goes back to what I told you with that analogy, having a big round of wood that's unsplit and unprocessed, and then either trying to start that with a ferro rod or a lighter under it. You know, it's just not going to work. Your tinder has to be prepared to accept the ignition source, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, what about moisture? This is where people say, oh, you're just a cheater, man. You don't know what you're doing because you can't do it unless, oh, and you get all, you can't light that, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but you can't do that unless you've got something that you've prepared to put that in there. Well, yeah, because I use my freaking brain. And I understand that I'm not always going to be able to have nor count on sourcing stuff that is going to work 100% of the time, all the time. If that's the world that you live in, quite honestly, you haven't spent enough time in the outdoors. If you have not had any fire fails, you have not spent any time in the outdoors. And that's just the truth. So what about all this stuff here? So all that is oxidation, okay? That's how a ferro rod works, is you have metals that are combustible, you have heat coming from the friction, you have the oxidation, so oxygen, friction, and fuel, which causes it to burn, and this just comes right off. But that's just orange oxidation from this stuff oxidizing at such a high degree, and that's what causes the orange residue, okay? Okay, I got to get one of these out. So you see this is my really great MK1, and then right here in these pins I'm just gonna pull this out here. Okay, so you can push it out maybe. I got a screw, I'll pull it out on this side. Push it through actually, there we go. Okay, bingo. And I'll show you what these are. I always stuff them. If I have a hollow handled tube, I like to stuff them. Call me a nerd. It's just a great way to carry a little bit of a backup in case, just in case things don't go your way. Okay, these are my homemade fire plugs, and this is essentially nothing more than cotton and paraffin wax and paraffin oil. And why I like these is because you just don't need much of it at all, and you can fluff this stuff out, and you can have something that's a little bit damper, maybe, that is struggling catching your spark. Okay, let me show you what I mean here. So we're just gonna pretend that stuff was a little bit too damp and not working as well as we'd hoped. Okay, let me put this here. I want to show you something, and this is why I'm an advocate of prepared tinders. Okay, let's just watch this burn time for a minute. And let me get an equivalent piece of cotton in the same amount while that is still burning. And I'm just gonna light that there, and let's just put that right there and see what happens. Oh my goodness. This is why sometimes using just regular cotton isn't going to be very effective. Even with prepared tinder, or you bring some with you, this is the benefit of adding just a little bit of paraffin or paraffin oil. And I add the paraffin oil with the paraffin just to keep it a little bit on the soft side so that I can fit it into my tubes without any problem. But we're still burning. We're still burning. So imagine this. Just put that out there really quick. Ooh, spicy. Okay, so let's do this. let's go ahead and get another one of these little plugs. And again, for those of you that didn't see, I just on my neck sheath right here, okay, I just have Ranger bands, and I carry 2 screws, one on each side, and I use one of those screws to basically push the plugs out of my pins. Okay, let me tuck this back in so I don't keep hitting the camera. I've had a real struggle hitting the camera. I got to get a different setup when I'm doing this. So okay, so we have this. Let's say that this was a little bit on the damp side. I think you're going to catch my drift of what I'm going at. So we get this to receive a spark, and we're going to do the same thing. This time I'm going to use my knife. I'm just going to point it down there, go down. And if this was a little bit damp, that paraffin wax in impregnated piece of cotton is just going to burn, and it's going to give enough heat for some of the smaller fibers to start to dry out. And then as those smaller fibers ignite, that's more heat, which causes some of the coarse fibers to dry out and then ignite. And you catch my drift. You can take something that has a little bit of dampness or moisture in it and actually increase your odds of making a fire with something like a Firesteel. So I'm gonna just push this over here, let that burn. Anyways, this is like a super 37-minute video now, and a lot of you probably won't make it till the end, but that's what I wanted to show you. When you're using a Firesteel, take into consideration the tool. Think about the diameter, the ability to throw more heat by having a longer rod or a shorter rod, but knowing what you need to take into consideration with Tinder to make either of them work. It really doesn't matter. Again, the only way that you can really learn that a Firesteel is garbage is by picking some of these ones up. I think this one came in a Dave Canterbury Pathfinder set, which really surprises me, because as much as this works, this is not a great Firesteel. I don't know where this one would be sourced, and I actually like Dave Canterbury's Pathfinder stuff, by the way. So as much as I'm ragging on this little freebie Firesteel that came in, I think the cook set, yeah, will it get the job done? Yeah, it will. But I'm gonna just be biased. These rods that I source, and then I just put a piece of what's it, the word I'm looking for, deck tape. Yeah, like skateboard deck tape that's like got sandpaper and sticky on the side. I just wrap a little bit around there and then put a little piece of paracord and make a lanyard and attach a striker to it. Or now too, I also have our metal rods that I get from 5 Coal. They're really nice rods. They're a 4" by 3/8 inch our metal rod, and I really like those. And on those ones, I sometimes will just put some Gorilla Tape. You know, Gorilla Tape actually makes a really good coal extender too. So if you had a piece of Gorilla Tape that you process down and put that in some, you know, slightly damp tinder, that would work awesome too. So yeah, the right tool. Think about your tinder, prepare your tinder sufficient enough to accept the ignition source, and take into consideration that you might be dealing with moisture. And if that is the case, be wise, bring something with you to offset and mitigate that risk if everything that you're sourcing out there might be a little bit damp. There's nothing wrong with that. And also with your technique, steady either downward motion with pressure, removing that material to burn inside it, or depending on the size of your tinder pile that you're trying to ignite, it may be better to anchor your knife and pull up. But just always remember, those sparks will go where the tip of your rod is. So if you want the sparks to go there, that probably isn't going to be the best thing for you. Okay. And again, maybe using a Firesteel isn't the best thing to actually get a fire going for you either. I will say that as much as I love Firesteels and flint and steel and, you know, all sorts of fun ways to live out my pyromaniac dreams, depending on what the situation is and what I'm trying to do, a Firesteel just might not be the right tool. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just because you can use something doesn't necessarily mean that you need to. I love using flint and steel. In fact, I have done that in a video when I was up in the Uintas and we did some fishing and spent a few days up in the mountains. I did a flint and steel fire with some feather sticks as my nest. And it was awesome. I did that because I could do it, not because I needed to do it. And sometimes the need to do something should outweigh, well, I can do it, but again, do I need to do that? Or should I just grab a lighter, a jet lighter or a Bic or whatever your preference is, and just get my shavings? If the wood is sucky enough that it's really hard to feather, just make a pile of shavings and then just light it. I mean, don't spend your time trying to ignite it with something if the material is too coarse that it just really is having a hard time accepting the spark. So anyways, I hope that this has been valuable. I'm not putting this out because I'm an expert, but I got thinking about this the other day after I was talking about the Firesteels, and I'm like, you know what? I don't have anything on my channel talking about, you know, technique and maybe some things to consider when using a Firesteel, which may make it easier for somebody because of hard lessons that I've had to learn going through this motion. So just want to be able to share what I've learned. Again, maybe some of the things that I've shared you think are not right, and by all means, leave your comments. Let me know what you think and what you think about the things that I've shared, or if you have anything to add of value in the comments that might benefit somebody else related to using a Firesteel or other considerations that maybe I overlooked or didn't think of in this 42-minute long-winded video. Feel free to share those. As always, I appreciate your support. Please like and subscribe, and until the next video, take care.